Close your eyes now, and imagine a moment that never came. London, 1883. A small house on Maitland Park Road grows quiet in the afternoon light, but the cough that should have taken him doesn't. The bronchitis that ravaged his lungs for weeks begins, impossibly, to recede. Karl Marx, 65 years old, exhausted, poor, mourning his wife, opens his eyes on March 14th and finds himself still breathing. The doctors cannot explain it. His daughter Eleanor brings him tea, her hands trembling, grateful and confused. He should have died. History expected it. The world was ready to memorialize him, to begin the arguments over his legacy, to let his words ossify into doctrine without his living voice to complicate them. But he does not die. And so, time must accommodate him. The hours pass. Days. Weeks. The illness fades like morning fog, and Marx finds himself walking again through Hampstead Heath, feeling the spring air fill lungs that should be still. He does not understand it. He writes to Engels, his oldest friend, his collaborator, his benefactor, and describes this strange reprieve in careful, materialist terms, seeking a rational explanation where none exists. There is only the fact, he continues, and the world, unaware of what this means, continues around him. History has just bent, softly, imperceptibly. The curve of the future has altered, though no one yet knows how much, or for how long, or what it will mean when the man who wrote Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto simply refuses to become memory. He sits in his study that first night of unexpected survival, surrounded by the chaos of papers and books, the manuscripts that were supposed to be his final legacy, and he realizes that perhaps they are not final at all. Perhaps there is more work to do, more to understand, more to witness. The lamplight flickers across his face, illuminating the deep lines carved by decades of poverty, exile, and intellectual struggle. And for the first time in years, he feels something strange rising in his chest. Not hope, exactly. Marx has never been a man given to simple hope, but curiosity. A deep, burning curiosity about what comes next, now that the ending everyone expected has been postponed. The years that follow are strange and slow. Marx remains in London, still poor, still dependent on Engels' generosity, still working in the reading room of the British Museum, where he spent so many years compiling notes, tracing the circulation of capital, building his critique of political economy. But now there is something different in his eyes. He is 70, then 75, then 80, and still his mind works, still his hand writes, though more slowly now. The other readers in the library grow accustomed to the old man who sits in the same seat, day after day, year after year, seemingly immune to the passage of time that marks them all. They do not know who he is. They do not recognize the face that will one day appear in textbooks and on posters and in the arguments of revolutionaries around the world. To them, he is simply another scholar, another eccentric, another fixture of the reading room's eternal present. He watches the socialist movements of Europe grow and fracture. He sees his words quoted, misquoted, weaponized, softened, radicalized, abandoned. In Germany, the Social Democratic Party grows in strength, and Marx writes letters, so many letters, trying to correct what he sees as errors, trying to steer the movement toward revolution rather than reform. But his influence is not what it was. He is old. He is a relic. The young socialists respect him. Yes, but they do not always listen. They have their own ideas now, their own interpretations, their own strategies. And Marx, who spent his life believing that history moved according to laws as iron as those governing nature, begins to see how human will bends those laws in unexpected ways. He sees the Paris Commune memorialized, romanticized, and he remembers watching it unfold in 1871, feeling both exhilarated and horrified, knowing it would fail but hoping desperately it wouldn't. Now, more than a decade later, he wonders what he missed, what he misunderstood about the timing of revolution, the readiness of the working class, the role of the state. He walks through London in the evenings, through streets thick with coal smoke and fog, past factories where children still work 14-hour days, past tenements where families crowd into single rooms, and he sees both the validation of his critique and the failure of his predictions. Yes, capitalism creates misery. Yes, exploitation continues. Yes, the contradictions deepen. But where is the revolution? Where is the uprising? Where is the moment when the working class, recognizing their common interests, rises as one to overthrow their oppressors? It has not come, and he begins to wonder if it will. By 1890, Marx is over 70 years old, and the world is changing faster than he anticipated. The Second International is founded, a coalition of socialist and labor parties from across Europe and beyond, and Marx attends the inaugural Congress in Paris. He sits in the back, wrapped in a heavy coat despite the summer warmth, listening to speeches in a dozen languages, watching young men and women debate the future of the movement he helped create. They speak of him with reverence, and also with a certain distance, as though he is already a monument, a founding father whose presence is symbolic rather than practical. He does not speak much at the Congress. When he does, his voice is soft, and the hall grows quiet to hear him. He warns against nationalism. He warns against allowing the movement to fracture along national lines, against letting the workers of one country see the workers of another as enemies rather than comrades. But he can see, even as he speaks, that his warnings are not enough. The forces of nationalism are powerful, woven into language and culture and history in ways his theory did not fully account for. He returns to London exhausted. Engels visits him often, and they sit together in Marx's cluttered study, surrounded by books and papers, talking as they have for 40 years, about philosophy, about politics, about the strange persistence of Marx's life. Engels is aging too, but Marx has somehow stopped, or slowed, his body holding steady at an age where it should have surrendered. They do not speak of it directly. There is no framework in their materialism for immortality, and so they talk around it, filling the silence with analysis, with memory, with the companionship of old men who have fought the same battles and lost most of them, but not all. They remember the revolutions of 1848, that spring of hope when barricades went up across Europe, when it seemed for a moment that the old order might truly fall. They remember the crushing disappointments that followed, the exile, the years of poverty in London, the slow work of building a theoretical foundation for a movement that seemed to have no immediate future. And now, 40 years later, the movement exists. It is real. It has parties, newspapers, unions, millions of members. But it is not what they imagined. It is not revolutionary, not in the way they meant. It is reformist, parliamentary, willing to work within the system rather than overthrow it. And Marx does not know whether to see this as a betrayal or simply as the necessary adaptation of theory to reality. Engels tells him to be patient, tells him that the movement is still young, that the contradictions of capitalism will continue to sharpen, that the moment of revolutionary rupture will come. But Marx is not sure. He has been patient for so long, and the longer he lives, the more he sees how history resists the neat patterns he tried to impose on it, how it zigs when theory says it should zag, how it produces outcomes no one predicted and leaves everyone scrambling to understand what just happened. Engels dies in 1895, and Marx is alone in a way he has never been before. He stands at the funeral, silent among the mourners, and feels the weight of something he cannot name, a loneliness that is not just personal but historical. He is the last of his generation now, the last of the revolutionaries who gathered in Paris and Brussels and London in the 1840s, who argued in smoky rooms and wrote manifestos and believed that the old world was about to shatter. And it did shatter, in some ways, but not in the way they expected. The world did not end. Capitalism did not collapse under the weight of its contradictions. It adapted. It grew. It found new markets, new methods, new ways to extract value and defer crisis. And the working class did not rise as one. They organized, yes. They struck, they protested, they formed unions and parties. But they also accepted reforms, incremental improvements, the slow grind of social democracy rather than the sudden rupture of revolution. Marx watches all this with a kind of weary clarity. He revises his notes. He writes new essays, published in socialist journals, read by fewer and fewer people as the years pass. He is an old man now, in his 80s, still sharp-minded but increasingly out of step with the movements that claim his name. In Russia, there are stirrings, reports of strikes, of revolutionary cells, of a growing discontent that reminds Marx of the 1840s. He reads these reports carefully, hopefully, wondering if perhaps this is where his theory will finally be tested, in a country that was barely industrialized, barely capitalist in the way he understood it. It troubles him. Russia does not fit his model. The proletariat is small, the peasantry vast, the autocracy brutal and backward. How can a socialist revolution happen there, when all his analysis suggests it should happen in the advanced capitalist countries, where the working class is large and organized and the contradictions most acute? But history, he is learning, does not always follow models. And Russia, with its unique combination of backwardness and revolutionary fervor, might just prove to be the exception that breaks all his rules. He corresponds with Russian socialists, with Plekhanov and others, trying to understand their situation, trying to offer guidance while also learning from them, recognizing that the struggle in Russia will take forms he never anticipated. And late at night, alone in his study, he wonders whether he should revise his theory, whether he should account for the possibility of revolution in the periphery, in the backward countries where capitalism has barely taken root. But he is tired, so tired, and the work of revision, of rethinking everything he has built over a lifetime, seems too immense, too exhausting. So he leaves it. He writes notes. He corresponds. He watches. And he waits to see what will happen in Russia, this country that haunts his imagination with its promise and its strangeness, this place where his theories might finally be tested, or finally proven inadequate. The turn of the century finds Marx still alive, still writing, still walking the streets of London like a ghost from another era. The world is electric now, lit by Edison's bulbs, connected by telegraph and telephone, moving faster than he ever imagined. The great empires carve up Africa and Asia, and Marx watches with a kind of horrified fascination, seeing his theories of imperialism playing out in real time, but also seeing how capitalism's expansion delays the crises he predicted, how the exploitation of colonies provides the surplus that pacifies the workers of Europe. He writes about this. Long, dense essays that few people read. The socialist movement has moved on. There are new theorists now, new leaders, new debates. Lenin, in Russia, is reading Marx and interpreting him in ways that make Marx uneasy, too focused on the vanguard, on the party, on seizing state power rather than dismantling it. But Marx is too old, too distant now to shape these debates. He is a name, a reference, a source of legitimacy, but not a living, active force. And yet he lives. His body, inexplicably, does not fail. He is 90, then 100, and still he wakes each morning, still he reads the newspapers, still he watches the world move forward without him. The people around him begin to notice. His landlady remarks that he looks the same as he did 20 years ago. His doctor, a young man now caring for a patient older than anyone should be, performs examinations and finds nothing wrong, nothing unusual, just an old man whose body simply refuses to age further. Word spreads, quietly, among the socialist circles. Marx is still alive. Marx is impossibly old. Marx is something. They do not have words for it. Some come to visit him, to see for themselves, to ask questions, to seek his blessing for their projects and movements. And Marx receives them kindly, but with a growing sense of displacement. He does not belong to this century. He belongs to the last one. And yet here he is, a relic, an anachronism, a man out of time. The First World War begins in 1914, and Marx sits in his study, reading the reports of slaughter, of workers killing workers across national lines, and he weeps. Not from sadness, though there is that, but from a kind of exhausted recognition. This is what he warned against. This is what the Second International was supposed to prevent. And it failed. The socialists of Europe voted for war credits, supported their respective nations, abandoned internationalism in the face of nationalist fervor. And millions died. Workers in German uniforms shooting workers in French uniforms, workers in British trenches gassed by workers in German trenches, all of them fighting for the profits and glory of the ruling classes they should have been overthrowing instead. It is the ultimate betrayal. The final proof that nationalism is stronger than class consciousness, that identity and culture and language can override material interests, that his theory, for all its power, missed something essential about human psychology, about the way people understand themselves and their allegiances. But then, 1917, Russia. The Tsar falls in February, and by October, the Bolsheviks have seized power. Marx, now 134 years old, reads the news with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. Lenin is leading the revolution. The workers' councils, the Soviets, are taking control. The old order is being smashed. And yet, Marx cannot shake the feeling that something is wrong. Russia was not ready. It was not industrialized enough, not capitalist enough. The proletariat was too small, the peasantry too large. This was not how it was supposed to happen. He writes letters to the Bolsheviks, cautious, questioning letters, trying to understand their strategy, their vision. Some are answered. Most are not. He is old news now, even to the revolutionaries who claim to follow his teachings. They have moved beyond him, adapted his ideas to circumstances he never anticipated, and they do not need his approval. The Russian Revolution succeeds, and then it hardens. The civil war is brutal. The Red Terror kills thousands. The party consolidates power, and the state, which was supposed to wither away, grows stronger instead. Marx watches, troubled, writing private notes that will never be published, trying to understand where the theory went wrong, or where the practice diverged from the theory, or whether they were ever aligned at all. He does not have answers, only questions. And time. So much time. He thinks about writing to Lenin directly, about traveling to Russia to see the revolution firsthand, to understand what is happening in this vast country where his ideas have been taken up with such fervor and such violence. But he is old. Travel is difficult. And he is not sure what he would say, what advice he could give to men who are fighting a civil war, defending their revolution against foreign intervention and internal enemies, making decisions in the heat of the moment that will shape the future of socialism for generations. So he stays in London. He reads. He writes. He corresponds with socialists across Europe, trying to make sense of what is happening, trying to understand whether Russia represents the future or an aberration, whether this is the beginning of the worldwide revolution he predicted or something else entirely, a revolution in one country, isolated, besieged, forced to adapt in ways that will distort the original vision beyond recognition. And the more he reads, the more uneasy he becomes. The Bolsheviks are establishing a dictatorship, not the dictatorship of the proletariat he envisioned, a temporary phase in which the working class suppresses the bourgeoisie while building the conditions for a classless society, but something else. A dictatorship of the party, of the vanguard, of men who claim to represent the workers but increasingly act in their own interests, consolidating power, eliminating rivals, building a state apparatus more powerful and more intrusive than anything the Tsars ever managed. The decades pass like pages turning in a book Marx can no longer read clearly. The Soviet Union becomes a superpower, and Stalin rises, and the purges begin, and millions die in famines and gulags, all in the name of building socialism, all justified with references to Marx's writings. He is horrified. He writes letters to Soviet officials, to Stalin himself, condemning what he sees as a betrayal of everything he believed. But the letters are ignored, or intercepted, or dismissed as the ravings of an old man who no longer understands the necessities of revolutionary struggle. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps he doesn't understand. Perhaps the world has changed in ways his 19th century mind cannot grasp. He moves through the 20th century like a sleepwalker, present but not participating, watching as his name is invoked to justify things he would have opposed, watching as communist parties rise and fall, as revolutions succeed and then calcify into dictatorships, as the Cold War divides the world into two camps and his ideas become weapons in a conflict he never imagined. He meets, occasionally, with historians and scholars who seek him out, curious about this impossible man who has lived so long. They ask him questions about his intentions, his meanings, his predictions. And he tries to answer, but the distance is too great now. The world of 1848, the world in which he wrote the manifesto, is as remote to him as the ancient world. He barely recognizes it. He barely recognizes himself. The man who wrote those words was young, angry, full of certainty that the old world was dying and a new one struggling to be born. But that man is gone now, lost somewhere in the long decades of waiting, of watching, of seeing his hopes realized in twisted forms and his warnings ignored. Stalin dies in 1953, and Marx feels nothing, or perhaps relief. A small, guilty relief that the man who did so much damage in his name is finally gone. But the damage remains. The Soviet Union remains. The system Stalin built, with its gulags and secret police and cult of personality and brutal enforcement of orthodoxy, that remains. And it is called socialism. It is called Marxism. And Marx, watching from his small apartment in London, supported now by a quiet arrangement with British socialists who understand the historical importance of keeping him alive and comfortable, can do nothing but write in his journals, filling page after page with reflections and self-criticism, and attempts to understand where it all went wrong. He reads the new generation of Marxist theorists. Gramsci, writing about hegemony in culture, expanding Marx's analysis beyond the purely economic. The Frankfurt School, developing critical theory, trying to understand why the working class of the West did not revolt, why fascism arose, why consciousness did not develop the way Marx predicted. And he finds in these thinkers a kind of comfort. They are not abandoning his method. They are adapting it, deepening it, recognizing its limitations while preserving its core insights. This, he thinks, is how theory should develop. Not as dogma, not as scripture, but as a living tradition that responds to new conditions, new challenges, new realities. By the 1960s, Marx is living quietly in a small apartment in East Berlin, supported by a modest stipend from the East German government, who keep his existence secret, unsure how to integrate this living relic into their official narrative. He is over 140 years old, and his body has finally begun to show its age, moving slowly, speaking softly, spending most of his days reading and writing in solitude. He watches the student movements of the late 60s with interest. In Paris, in Prague, in Berkeley, young people are reading his early works, the humanist writings on alienation and freedom, and they are using them to critique not just capitalism, but also the authoritarian socialism of the Soviet bloc. He feels a flicker of hope. Perhaps this is it. Perhaps this generation will reclaim the emancipatory core of his ideas, will reject both the capitalist exploitation and the state oppression that have defined the 20th century. But the movements fail. Prague Spring is crushed by Soviet tanks. The Paris protests fizzle out. The new left fragments into 1,000 sects and tendencies, each claiming to have the correct interpretation of Marx, none of them powerful enough to change the world. And Marx, watching, feels the weight of futility settle over him like a heavy blanket. He writes less now. What is there left to say? His ideas have been tested, twisted, triumphant, and catastrophic. They have liberated millions and enslaved millions. They have inspired both the noblest struggles for justice and the cruelest tyrannies. And he is still here, still breathing, still witnessing, a witness without power, without influence, without even the mercy of an ending. The East German officials who manage his care are kind but distant. They bring him books, newspapers, whatever he requests. But they do not engage with him intellectually. They are bureaucrats, not revolutionaries. They work for a state that calls itself socialist but feels nothing like the society Marx imagined, a society of abundance and freedom, where the state has withered away and people govern themselves through democratic councils, where work is no longer alienated labor but free creative activity, where the material conditions finally allow human beings to develop all their capacities, to become fully human. Instead, East Germany is grey, regimented, surveilled. The people are provided for, yes, housing, healthcare, education, all guaranteed. But they are not free. They cannot travel. They cannot speak openly. They live under the watchful eye of the Stasi, the secret police who monitor every aspect of life, who enforce conformity and punish dissent. And this, too, is called socialism. This, too, is done in his name. He walks sometimes through the streets of East Berlin, an old man in a long coat, invisible among the crowds. And he sees the banners, the slogans, the images of Lenin and Marx himself, his own face stylized and iconic, reproduced on posters and stamps and monuments. And he feels like a ghost haunting his own legacy, a spectre watching the world misuse his ideas, watching his name become a symbol for things he never intended, never wanted, never imagined. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and Marx stands in the crowd, wrapped in a long coat, watching as East Germans stream through the checkpoints, weeping and laughing and embracing their Western counterparts. He feels nothing, or perhaps everything. It is hard to tell anymore. The Cold War is over, and capitalism has won, and the Soviet experiment has collapsed, and commentators around the world are declaring the end of history, the final triumph of liberal democracy and free markets. And Marx simply walks home. He writes in his journal that night, a long, rambling entry about the cyclical nature of history, about the persistence of class struggle even in the absence of communist states, about the new forms of exploitation emerging in the global economy. But no one will read it. No one cares what the old man thinks anymore. Communism is dead, they say, and with it, Marx's relevance. Except, he is not dead. And communism, as an idea, as a critique, as a method of understanding the world, does not die either. It mutates. It adapts. It finds new expressions in the global justice movement, in the anti-capitalist protests of the late 90s and early 2000s, in the writings of academics and activists who are grappling with the contradictions of neoliberalism, the rising inequality, the ecological crisis, the sense that capitalism, for all its resilience, is driving the world toward catastrophe. Marx observes the collapse of the Soviet Union not with satisfaction, but with a complex mixture of emotions he cannot quite untangle. There is relief, certainly, relief that the system which committed so many crimes in his name is finally gone. But there is also sadness. The Soviet Union, for all its failures and brutalities, represented an attempt to build an alternative to capitalism, to organize society on different principles. And now it is gone, and the consensus is that there is no alternative, that capitalism is the only viable system, that history has ended with the triumph of the market. He does not believe this. He cannot believe this. History does not end. And the contradictions of capitalism that he identified in the 19th century have not been resolved. They have merely been displaced, deferred, hidden beneath layers of consumer culture and financial abstraction. But they are still there. The exploitation, the inequality, the crises, the tendency for wealth to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands, the alienation, the degradation of work and life, all of it remains. And so, he believes, the struggle remains too, even if it takes new forms, even if it no longer calls itself Marxism, even if his name becomes an embarrassment associated with the failures of the 20th century rather than the critiques that remain relevant. He moves to a small apartment in what is now unified Berlin, supported by a pension arranged through connections he has maintained over the decades, connections with scholars and activists who understand his historical importance even if they disagree with his conclusions. And he settles in to watch the new century approach, wondering what it will bring, what new forms capitalism will take, what new struggles will emerge. Marx lives into the 21st century, an impossibly old man, over 170 now, living in a small apartment in Berlin, unknown to almost everyone, his existence a secret kept by a handful of historians and government officials who are unsure what to do with him. He has outlived communism, outlived the Soviet Union, outlived the Cold War. He has outlived his own relevance, or so it seems. And yet, the world continues to grapple with the questions he asked. Why does wealth concentrate in fewer and fewer hands? Why does labor create value but laborious remain poor? Why does the system that produces abundance also produce misery? These questions have not been answered. Capitalism has not solved them. It has only deferred them, displaced them, hidden them beneath layers of consumer culture and financial abstraction. And so, people still read Marx. Students, activists, scholars. They read him not as a prophet, not as the founder of a failed ideology, but as a thinker who understood something essential about the structure of the modern world, about the tension between those who own and those who work, about the relentless drive for accumulation that shapes every aspect of life under capitalism. Marx reads their essays, their books, their blog posts. He watches the Occupy movement. He watches the rise of democratic socialism in the United States, young people rallying around ideas that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. He watches the climate crisis unfold, the wildfires and floods and droughts, and sees in them the ultimate contradiction, a system that requires infinite growth on a finite planet. He writes occasionally, short pieces, published under pseudonyms, contributions to obscure left-wing journals. No one knows they are written by the original Karl Marx. They would not believe it if they were told. The internet fascinates and disturbs him. It is a technology beyond anything he imagined, a global network that connects billions of people, that makes information instantly accessible, that allows for new forms of organization and communication. And yet it is also a tool of surveillance and control, a marketplace where attention is commodified and data is extracted and every interaction is monetized. He sees in the internet the same contradictions he saw in the factories of the 19th century. The technology has emancipatory potential, the potential to democratize knowledge, to enable global cooperation, to break down barriers. But under capitalism, it is used primarily to generate profit, to concentrate wealth, to monitor and manipulate. The platforms are owned by a handful of billionaires. The algorithms serve the interests of advertisers. The promise of connection has produced isolation, polarization, addiction. And Marx writes about this, in his journals and his pseudonymous essays, trying to understand how his analysis of industrial capitalism can be adapted to this new digital capitalism. This system where the means of production are not factories but servers, where the commodity being produced is not goods but data, where the worker is not the factory laborer but the user, laboring unpaid to generate content and attention that others monetize. He thinks often now about his life, about the long arc of it, about the things he got right and the things he got wrong. He was right about exploitation, about the extraction of surplus value, about the tendency of capital to concentrate. He was right about the instability of capitalism, its cycles of boom and bust, its need to constantly expand. He was right that the system creates its own gravediggers, that the working class would organize, would resist, would fight for better conditions. But he was wrong about the timeline. He thought revolution was imminent, that the contradictions would become unbearable within his lifetime, his original lifetime, the 70 or 80 years he should have had. He did not anticipate how adaptable capitalism would be, how it would reform itself, incorporate the demands of workers, create welfare states and consumer cultures that blunted the edge of class conflict. He did not anticipate nationalism, not fully, not the way it would divide the working class, not the way it would survive and even thrive in the 20th century. He did not anticipate the Soviet Union, the way that revolution in a backward country would lead not to the withering away of the state but to its monstrous enlargement. He did not anticipate Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, the horrors committed in his name. And he has lived long enough to see all of it, to see his hopes realized and corrupted, to see his critiques validated and weaponized, to see the movements he inspired succeed and fail and rise again in new forms, generation after generation, never quite achieving the emancipation he envisioned but never quite giving up on it either. On quiet afternoons, he sits by his window and watches the city below. Berlin is unrecognizable from the city he knew in his youth, when he studied with the young Hegelians and first began to develop his critique of idealist philosophy. It is modern now, rebuilt after the devastation of World War II, reunified after the fall of the wall, a gleaming testament to capitalism's ability to regenerate, to absorb and overcome its crises. And yet beneath the gleaming surface, the contradictions persist. The homeless sleep in doorways. Migrants work precarious jobs. The young struggle to afford housing. The climate warms. And Marx sees that nothing fundamental has changed. The form has changed. The technology has changed. The ideology has changed. But the structure remains. A small class owns the means of production. A large class works, or tries to work, or cannot work. Value is extracted. Wealth concentrates. And those at the bottom struggle to survive while those at the top accumulate fortunes beyond measure. He reads about the billionaires of the 21st century. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, men who own the platforms and infrastructure of the digital economy, who have amassed wealth that would have been inconceivable to the robber barons of the 19th century. And he sees in them the same logic he identified so long ago. The logic of capital, the drive to accumulate, the tendency for wealth to concentrate. the indifference to human suffering in the pursuit of profit. Nothing has changed, and everything has changed. The technology is different. The scale is different. The mechanisms are different. But the fundamental dynamic is the same. And Marx, who has lived long enough to see all of this unfold, who has watched capitalism survive every crisis and adapt to every challenge, cannot help but wonder whether he was wrong about the possibility of transcending it, whether capitalism is not a phase in human history, but a permanent condition, an inescapable logic that will persist as long as there are resources to exploit and markets to expand into. In the 2020s, the world is convulsed by pandemic and protest. Marx watches from his apartment as millions march for racial justice, for climate action, for economic equality. He watches as billionaires accumulate wealth beyond the imagination of 19th-century aristocrats, as gig workers and warehouse laborers and delivery drivers struggle to survive. He watches as the language of socialism re-enters mainstream discourse, as politicians speak of Medicare for all and the Green New Deal, as young people poll overwhelmingly in favor of socialism over capitalism. And he wonders, is this it? Is this the moment? Or is it just another cycle, another wave that will crest and break and recede, leaving the structure intact? He does not know. He has lived too long to be certain of anything. History, he has learned, does not progress in a straight line. It spirals, loops back, repeats itself with variations. The same struggles recur in new contexts, with new technologies, new languages, new actors, but the fundamental conflict remains. Those who own, those who work, those who profit, those who suffer. And the question, always the question, can it be otherwise? He believes it can. Even now, after everything, he believes that a world beyond exploitation is possible, that human beings are capable of organizing society on the basis of cooperation rather than competition, of meeting needs rather than maximizing profit. But he also knows, more than anyone, how difficult it is, how many obstacles stand in the way, how easily revolutions can be betrayed, movements co-opted, victories reversed. The pandemic reveals the fragility of the global system. Supply chains break down. Millions lose their jobs. The stock market crashes and then recovers, propped up by government intervention, while ordinary people struggle. And Marx sees in this the same pattern he identified in the 19th century. The socialization of losses, the privatization of gains, the state intervening to save capitalism from its own contradictions, while leaving workers to fend for themselves. But he also sees something new, a recognition, growing slowly but surely, that the system is not working, that it cannot deliver security or stability or a decent life for most people, that something fundamental must change. The protests in the summer of 2020, sparked by the murder of George Floyd, bring millions into the streets. And Marx watches with a complex mixture of emotions. He sees the anger, the energy, the solidarity. He sees people recognizing their common interests across racial lines, coming together to demand not just reform but transformation. But he also sees the limitations, the lack of clear demands, the difficulty of sustaining momentum, the ease with which protest can be absorbed, commodified, turned into a brand rather than a movement. And he wonders whether this generation will succeed where others failed, whether they will find a way to build power, to organize, to create structures that can challenge the entrenched interests of capital, or whether they, too, will fall short, defeated by the same forces that have defeated every challenge to capitalism for the past 200 years. He walks sometimes through the streets of Berlin, an old man leaning on a cane, invisible among the crowds. No one recognizes him. No one would believe it if you told them. Karl Marx, alive in the 21st century, watching the world he tried to change continue on without him. He stops at cafes, orders coffee, sits by the window and reads the news on a tablet a young historian gave him, his ancient eyes adjusting slowly to the bright screen. He reads about Amazon workers unionizing in Alabama, about miners striking in South Africa, about nurses in the UK demanding better pay, about indigenous communities resisting pipelines, about climate activists blocking roads and airports and ports. And he sees in all of these struggles the same pattern he identified so long ago: people coming together, organizing, fighting for their collective interests against the power of capital. It is not the revolution he imagined, not a single, unified, global uprising of the working class, but it is something. It is resistance. It is the refusal to accept the world as it is. And that, he thinks, is where it always begins. With refusal. With the recognition that things do not have to be this way. With the courage to demand something better. He writes, in his notebooks, thoughts on what he calls late capitalism. Though he smiles at the term, how many times has capitalism been declared late, near death, in crisis? And yet it persists. It adapts. It survives. But perhaps, he thinks, survival is not the same as victory. Perhaps capitalism can survive its crises without resolving its contradictions. Perhaps it can limp on, increasingly dysfunctional, increasingly brutal, increasingly incapable of delivering even the modest promise of shared prosperity it once offered. And perhaps, in that limping persistence, the conditions are being created for something genuinely new. Not a return to the Soviet model. Not state socialism. But something else. Something more democratic, more ecological, more human. He thinks about the young people he has met over the years, the activists and scholars who sought him out, who wanted to learn from him, who saw in his work not a blueprint but a method, a way of thinking about the world that remains relevant even as the world changes. And he feels a kind of quiet pride. Not in himself, exactly. He has made too many mistakes, gotten too many things wrong, seen too much horror committed in his name to feel simple pride. But pride in the persistence of the struggle, in the refusal to give up, in the way each generation rediscovers the questions he asked and tries to answer them anew, in ways appropriate to their own time and place. This, he thinks, is what theory should be. Not dogma, not scripture, but a living tradition, a conversation across generations, a set of tools for understanding and changing the world, tools that must be adapted and refined and sometimes discarded as conditions change. And if his contribution to that tradition is to have asked the right questions, even if he did not always find the right answers, well, that is something. That is not nothing. He meets, occasionally, with young activists and scholars. They seek him out, the few who know his secret, who understand who he really is. They come with questions, with hopes, with anger, with exhaustion. They ask him what to do, how to win, how to build a movement, that can actually challenge the power of capital. And he tells them, gently, that he does not have answers. That he never did, not really. That his work was always a critique, an analysis, a method, not a blueprint. That the task of building a better world belongs to those who are living in it, who understand its specific conditions, its specific contradictions. He tells them that he was wrong about many things, that they should not treat his writings as scripture, that they should argue with him, challenge him, take what is useful and discard the rest. And some of them are disappointed. They wanted certainty. They wanted a prophet. They wanted Marx to tell them that revolution is inevitable, that history is on their side, that victory is assured if they just follow the correct line. But Marx cannot give them that. He knows too much now. He has seen too much. And yet, he also tells them not to despair, that the struggle is long, that setbacks are inevitable, that progress is not linear, that every generation must fight its own battles, learn its own lessons, make its own history. He tells them that he believes in them, that he believes in the possibility of change, even if he cannot predict when or how it will come. And they leave, some inspired, some confused, some angry, but all of them touched by the strange experience of talking to a man who should have died in 1883, a man who has lived through communism's rise and fall and witnessed the persistence of the very system he devoted his life to critiquing. They ask him about the Soviet Union, about Stalin, about the gulags, and he does not defend them. He cannot. The crimes committed in his name haunt him. But he also tries to help them understand that the Soviet Union was not the inevitable outcome of his ideas, that it was shaped by specific circumstances, the backwardness of Russia, the brutality of the Civil War, the isolation and siege mentality, the absence of democratic traditions, the decisions made by individuals who could have chosen differently. He tells them that socialism is not a single thing, a single model to be implemented, that it is a goal, a direction, a set of principles, democracy, equality, solidarity, the common ownership of the means of production, that can be realized in different ways in different contexts. That the failure of the Soviet model does not mean the failure of the socialist project itself. And some of them understand this. Some of them take it to heart. Others remain skeptical. Others have lost faith entirely, convinced that any attempt to transcend capitalism will lead to tyranny and terror. And Marx respects their skepticism. How could he not? He has lived through the 20th century. He has seen what was done in his name. If he cannot convince them that another world is possible, well, that is the burden of history. That is the weight of failure. The climate crisis deepens. Wildfires sweep across continents. Ice sheets collapse. Entire cities flood. Millions of people are displaced, becoming refugees from uninhabitable regions, while the rich retreat to climate-controlled enclaves and private islands. And Marx watches, and writes, and thinks about the ultimate contradiction, a system that treats the planet as an infinite resource, that cannot stop growing even as it destroys the conditions for its own survival. He revisits his early writings on the metabolic rift, the idea that capitalism disrupts the natural exchange between humans and the earth, creating an unsustainable separation between production and ecology. He was onto something, he realizes. But he did not foresee the scale of it, the way industrial capitalism would not just disrupt local ecologies but destabilize the entire climate system. And now, in the 21st century, the stakes are not just economic or political but existential. The question is not just whether capitalism can be overthrown, but whether it can be overthrown in time to prevent catastrophe. He does not know. No one does. But he sees, in the climate movement, in the youth marching in the streets, in the growing recognition that business as usual is a path to ruin, he sees the possibility of a new kind of politics, one that connects the struggle for social justice with the struggle for ecological survival. And he wonders if this, finally, might be the force that breaks the system open. Not the industrial proletariat of his 19th century imagination, but a broader coalition, workers, yes, but also communities on the front lines of environmental destruction, indigenous peoples protecting their lands, young people demanding a future. It is not what he predicted, but it is what the moment requires. The Green New Deal, proposed in various forms across different countries, interests him. It is not socialism, not exactly, but it represents a recognition that the market cannot solve the climate crisis, that massive public investment is needed, that the economy must be restructured around sustainability rather than growth. And he sees in this the possibility of a transitional program, something that moves in the direction of decommodifying the economy, of subordinating the logic of capital to social and ecological needs. But he also sees the obstacles: the power of the fossil fuel industry, the resistance of capital to any constraint on its accumulation, the short-term thinking of politicians facing electoral cycles, the difficulty of coordinating action across nations with competing interests. And he wonders whether it will be enough, whether anything will be enough. The scientists say there is a narrow window to act, a few years to dramatically reduce emissions before feedback loops make catastrophic warming inevitable. And Marx, who has lived for nearly 200 years, who has watched countless moments of opportunity pass, countless movements fail to achieve their goals, cannot help but fear that this moment, too, will be lost, that the system will continue on its destructive path until it collapses, taking much of the biosphere with it. By the 2040s, Marx is nearing 200 years old, a living impossibility, a man who has outlived his era by more than a century and a half. The world has changed in ways he could never have imagined. Automation has displaced millions of jobs. Artificial intelligence manages supply chains, predicts consumer behavior, even writes and composes and creates art. The nature of work itself has transformed, become precarious, fragmented, mediated by algorithms and platforms. And yet, the fundamental structure remains. A small class owns the means of production, now digital, now global, now algorithmic. And the rest work, or try to work, or struggle to survive in a system that has less and less need for their labor, but no mechanism to provide for them outside of it. There is talk, serious talk now, of universal basic income, of decoupling survival from employment, of recognizing that in an age of abundance created by technology, there is no reason for poverty to exist. And Marx listens to these debates with interest. This is not socialism, not in the way he conceived it. But it is a recognition, at least, that the market cannot solve everything, that some mechanism of redistribution is necessary, that leaving people to starve in the midst of plenty is both morally indefensible and politically unstable. He writes about this. Long, discursive essays that few people read, published in obscure corners of the internet under names no one recognizes. He argues that basic income, while potentially humane, is not enough. That it does not address the fundamental question of power, of who controls the means of production, who makes the decisions about what is produced and how. That a society can provide bread and still be a prison. The automation debate reminds him of the 19th century, of the Luddites smashing machines, of the fear that technology would make workers obsolete. And he remembers writing about this, about how capitalism creates a contradiction. It develops technology to increase productivity, to reduce the need for labor, but it also depends on labor as the source of value and as consumers. So automation creates a crisis. It increases output while reducing employment. It concentrates wealth while destroying the purchasing power needed to buy what is produced. And he sees this contradiction playing out now, in the 21st century, as robots and algorithms replace workers while the economy struggles with stagnant demand, rising debt, and growing inequality. The solution, he argued back then, was not to resist technology, but to change the social relations, to ensure that the benefits of increased productivity were shared rather than concentrated, that the reduction in necessary labor freed people for other pursuits rather than condemning them to unemployment and poverty. But capitalism cannot do this. It cannot distribute the benefits of automation equitably because it is organized around profit, around the private ownership of the means of production. So the technology that should liberate enslaves. And Marx sees that the choice facing humanity now is the same choice he identified in the 19th century. Socialism or barbarism. A society that uses technology for human flourishing, or a society that allows technology to be used for exploitation and control. He thinks often about freedom now, not just freedom from want, though that is essential, but freedom in a deeper sense. The freedom to develop one's capacities, to engage in meaningful activity, to participate in the collective decisions that shape one's life. This was always, he realizes, the core of his vision. Not just the abolition of poverty, but the creation of a society in which human beings could flourish, could become fully human, liberated from the alienation and domination that capitalism imposes. And that vision has not been realized. Not in the Soviet Union, not in China, not in any of the states that claim to build socialism. And not, certainly, in the capitalist West, where wealth has grown but alienation persists, where people are freer in some ways but more isolated, more anxious, more medicated, more unsure of their place in a world that seems to be accelerating beyond anyone's control. He does not have solutions. He has critiques. He has questions. He has a method, a way of looking at the world that insists on understanding the material basis of social relations, the economic structures that shape culture and politics and consciousness. And that method, he believes, is still useful, still necessary, even if the specific predictions he made have not come to pass, even if the world has taken paths he did not anticipate. The method remains, the questions remain, and so the struggle remains. He receives visitors still, though fewer now. His existence is known to a small circle of scholars, activists, government officials. Some want to exploit him, to use his name and authority for their projects. Others are genuinely curious, seeking to understand this strange anomaly, This man who has lived through eras that should be separated by the unbridgeable distance of death and forgetting. A young philosopher comes to see him, a woman who has written extensively on alienation and technology. She asks him whether he still believes in human nature, whether he still thinks there is some essence to humanity that capitalism distorts and socialism would allow to flourish. And Marx pauses. He thought about this a great deal in his youth, about whether human beings are naturally cooperative or competitive, naturally good or naturally selfish. And he came to believe that human nature is not fixed but historical, shaped by material conditions, by the mode of production. That capitalism produces a certain kind of person, competitive, individualistic, acquisitive, not because these traits are innate but because they are rewarded, necessary for survival in a market society. And he still believes this. But he also believes, now, that the malleability of human nature cuts both ways. That if capitalism can shape people to be selfish, then another system could shape them to be cooperative. But there is no guarantee, no determinism, only possibility, and the realization of that possibility depends on struggle, on choice, on the decisions people make individually and collectively about what kind of world they want to live in. In the 2060s, climate refugees number in the hundreds of millions. Wars are fought over water and arable land. The old nation-states fracture, and new forms of organization emerge, some more democratic, some brutally authoritarian. The global economy has become a patchwork of different systems, some clinging to market capitalism, others experimenting with forms of digital socialism, mutualism, cooperative production. Marx watches all of this from a small room in what used to be Berlin, now part of a federated network of autonomous cities. He is cared for by a rotation of young people who have taken it upon themselves to protect this strange, impossible man, this living link to the 19th century. He speaks rarely now. His voice is a whisper. His body is finally failing, though somehow it still does not quite surrender. He reads, when his eyes allow it. He listens to the news, to the debates, to the struggles playing out across the world. And he feels a kind of peace. Not because the world is as he hoped it would be. It is not. But because the struggle continues. Because people have not given up. Because in every generation, there are those who refuse to accept exploitation, who organize, who resist, who dream of something better. That, he thinks, is the real revolution. Not a single event, a storming of the Winter Palace or a general strike that brings the system to its knees. But an ongoing process, a constant contestation, a refusal to let the powerful have the final word. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all it ever was. A struggle, a conversation, a movement toward justice that never quite arrives but never quite ends either. The climate catastrophe has forced changes that political movements could not. Entire economic sectors have been abandoned. Coastal cities evacuated. New forms of social organization created out of necessity, as people learned to cooperate or die. And in some places, Marx hears, there are experiments that look something like what he imagined, communes where property is held in common, where decisions are made democratically, where work is organized cooperatively and the surplus is distributed according to need. They are small, fragile, constantly threatened by external forces, by states and corporations that see them as threats or opportunities for exploitation. But they exist. And that, too, is something. He thinks about writing one last book, one final attempt to synthesize everything he has learned, to revise and update his theory for the 21st century, to offer guidance to the movements struggling to build a better world. But he is too tired. His hands shake when he tries to write. His thoughts, once so clear and systematic, now wander and loop, losing their thread. So he contents himself with conversations, with the young people who care for him, with the occasional visitor who seeks him out. He tells them stories about the revolutions of 1848, about the Paris Commune, about the long years of exile and poverty in London, working in the British Museum, writing Das Kapital, arguing with Engels about philosophy and strategy, about the hope and horror of the Russian Revolution, about the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, about all the long centuries he has witnessed, all the struggles and failures and small victories. And they listen, and they ask questions, and they argue with him, challenge his ideas, point out where he was wrong. And he is grateful for this, for the engagement, for the recognition that his work is not scripture but a contribution to an ongoing conversation about how to understand and change the world. He dreams sometimes of Jenny, his wife, dead now for nearly 200 years. He dreams of their children, of Eleanor and Laura, of the son who died in infancy. He dreams of Engels, of all the nights they spent arguing and laughing and planning the revolution that never came, or came and failed, or came and succeeded and became something monstrous, depending on how you measure it. He dreams of his youth, of the young Hegelians debating in Berlin, of the Rhineland newspapers he edited before being exiled, of Paris in the 1840s, that ferment of ideas and movements, the sense that everything was possible. And he wakes, and he is old beyond measure, and the world has moved on without him, and yet somehow he is still here, still breathing, still thinking, still witnessing. He does not know why. There is no materialist explanation for his continued existence. Perhaps, he thinks in moments of weakness, there is something beyond materialism, some force or purpose or accident that has kept him alive to see how it all turns out. But it never turns out. It just continues. History does not end. It does not resolve. It moves, shifts, changes, but the fundamental questions persist, and the struggles persist, and the hope persists, fragile and stubborn and unkillable. And so Marx persists too, not because he wants to. He is tired. He has been tired for a century, but because something, somewhere, will not let him go, will not let him rest, will not let him escape the world he tried so hard to understand and change. A journalist comes to interview him, one of the few allowed access. She is young, sharp, skeptical. She asks him whether he has any regrets. And Marx laughs, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. Regrets? Where would he even begin? He regrets the violence committed in his name. He regrets the certainty with which he made predictions that turned out to be wrong. He regrets not understanding nationalism better, not seeing how powerful it would be, how it would divide the working class and lead to wars that killed millions. He regrets the poverty he put his family through, the children who died young, the wife who suffered. He regrets so much, but he does not regret the work. He does not regret the attempt to understand capitalism, to reveal its inner workings, to show how exploitation functions, to give workers the tools to understand their own oppression. That work was necessary. It remains necessary, even if he got many things wrong. Even if the movements inspired by his work committed terrible crimes. The critique of capitalism that he developed, that still matters. Because capitalism still exists. And it still produces exploitation, inequality, alienation, crisis. And people still need ways to understand that, to analyze it, to resist it. So no, he does not regret the work. Only the suffering. Only the failures. Only the long, impossible life that has forced him to witness all of it. To see his hopes betrayed and his warnings ignored and his legacy twisted beyond recognition. It is 2083, 200 years since the day he should have died, and Karl Marx is still alive. He sits by a window, looking out at a city he no longer recognizes, listening to sounds he cannot quite identify, technology humming and whirring and connecting everything to everything else in ways that baffle him. The young people who care for him bring him news. Another strike, somewhere in the global south. Another climate disaster, somewhere in the global north. Another experiment in worker ownership, in cooperative production, in democratic planning. Another failure. Another success. Another step forward. Another step back. And he listens, and nods, and sometimes he smiles, that faint, weary smile of a man who has seen it all and knows that nothing is ever truly new, and yet everything is always changing. They ask him sometimes what he thinks, whether he still believes, whether, after everything, he still thinks a better world is possible. And he tells them, in a voice so soft they have to lean in to hear, yes. Not because he has evidence, not because history has proven him right, but because the alternative is despair. And despair, he has learned, is a luxury that those who struggle cannot afford. So he believes, and he continues, and the world continues around him, turning, grinding, producing and destroying, creating wealth and misery in equal measure. And somewhere, always somewhere, people are organizing, resisting, imagining, building. And Marx simply watches, a witness to time, a ghost in the machine of history, immortal, impossible, irrelevant, and yet somehow, still necessary. Still a name that people invoke when they try to understand why the world is the way it is, and how it might be otherwise. The light fades outside his window. Another day ending. Another century unfolding. And Karl Marx lives on. His body, finally, is beginning to fail. He can feel it. The strength leaving his limbs. The clarity fading from his thoughts. The weight of 200 years pressing down, demanding rest. And he is ready, so ready, to let go, to finally become memory, to join Jenny and Engels and all the others who have long since passed. But still he breathes. Still he opens his eyes each morning. Still he witnesses the endless, exhausting, beautiful struggle of humanity to create a world worth living in. And perhaps, he thinks, that is the point. Not that he should have all the answers. Not that his theory should be complete and correct and final. But that he should bear witness. That he should see how it unfolds. That he should understand, in a way no one else can, the long arc of history, the way struggles echo across centuries, the way each generation faces the same fundamental questions and must answer them anew. Outside, the city hums with life. Millions of people going about their days, working and loving and struggling and hoping, most of them unaware that in a small room overlooking the street, the man who wrote the Communist Manifesto 235 years ago is sitting by a window, watching them, thinking about them, believing in them, believing that they will find a way, that they will build something better, that the struggle will continue, and that, perhaps, is enough. Perhaps that is all he ever really wanted. Not to provide all the answers. Not to predict the future. Not to be proven right. But to ask the right questions. To point the way. To give people tools for understanding and changing their world. And to trust them to do the work. The work that never ends. The work of making history. The work of creating freedom. The work of building, generation after generation, a world where human beings can finally be fully human. He closes his eyes, and for a moment, he is young again, in Paris, in 1844, meeting Engels for the first time, arguing about Hegel and Feuerbach and the future of philosophy, feeling the electricity of ideas, the sense that they were onto something big, something that mattered. And then he opens his eyes. And he is old, 200 years old. And the future is still unwritten. And the struggle continues. And Karl Marx watches and waits and finally, slowly, begins to let go.